All you, Eitan.
What's going on, guys? Welcome to the shop. Welcome to the show. Welcome to the Dynasty Diagnostic podcast. My name is Eitan Mozia. You can find me on Twitter at Eitan Alive. I'm joined by Sam Lane. You can find him at FF Stompy. And at the other end of our safe social distancing guideline mandated internet connection, today's a name you will all know well. So instead of an outright announcement or grand proclamation of sorts, as I usually do, I'll start with a few clues. Well-kept secret, this man was cast in Avengers Endgame. He's also a self-described company man. Copyright. And most importantly, he's the best-selling author of the novel Fantasy Life, creator of sites such as thetalentedmrroto.com as well as RotoPass, an unparalleled fantasy entrepreneur and host of the fantasy-focused football podcast on ESPN. Please join me in welcoming the GOAT, Matthew Berry.
What's up, guys? Thanks for having me.
Hey, man, we really appreciate you coming on. I know you're a busy guy, especially now under quarantine restrictions and having kids at home, as you were talking about, and your daughter repurposed your iPad. So, but thanks for coming on. Thanks for taking the time. It's an honor to have you.
I appreciate that, guys. No, it's my pleasure. It is. I have 5 kids, and so and what's weird is that normally this time of year is fairly low in terms of the amount of content I generate for ESPN because of at this usually we've got baseball going on and NBA playoffs are starting and March Madness is just ending. It's just so there's last couple of weeks, but with all that gone. NFL free agency is literally all we have to talk about. And so the content demands on me have been significantly more than they normally are. Then you couple that with the fact that, a significant lack of resources. It's, it's me and a phone and an iPad and trying to find a quiet room in my house. So it's definitely a different time for all of us, but we're all, listen, ultimately I'm healthy and my family's healthy. And so these days can't ask for much more than that. So feel very blessed and happy to join you guys.
Absolutely. We definitely feel the same way. And I wanted to kind of start this off, as I'm sure most of your podcast appearances do start off. I'm certain the first question that you get on nearly every appearance is some combination of how you got to where you are or what advice you would give to aspiring analysts. And I don't want to kind of say that we're not going to get into that, because we definitely are, because we have to. If I don't ask you those questions, what am I even doing with myself? But we're going to skip that for now. We're going to go into a question that maybe some people might not have known. I put in so much time and effort into the research in this. This is definitely not straight off of Wikipedia.com, but I found that you are a West Ham Hammers fan and have been for a number of years now. Is that correct?
Sort of. Yes. So the answer is yes, that is on my Wikipedia page, or I assume I haven't checked it in a while, but it sounds like it still is. And my Wikipedia page is probably about 80% right. And so a long time ago, this gives you how long ago. So you mentioned I do the Fantasy Focus Football podcast for ESPN. And prior to what I do now, which is I co-host it with Field Yates and Stefania Bell, Daniel Dopp. Before that, I used to do it with a guy named Nate Rabbits. So we've been doing the show for 11 years. And at one point, I forget how it came up, but at one point we were talking about soccer and that we should choose a team. And I honestly don't remember how we got into the bit, because it's literally, for people that have listened to me for a long time, they're like, wow, back in the Nate days. So that's at least 5 or 6 years ago. And it's probably longer than that. But a reader emailed in and asked about what my favorite team was, and I didn't have one. And so we were going through, and I didn't want to do Man U. I didn't want to do, Man City. I didn't want to do, Liverpool. I didn't want to do an obvious soccer team. So we decided, as we were going through the all the potential options, I decided on West Ham. And so I announced that I had decided to become a fan of West Ham. It struck me as a funny name, West Ham United. And So to the extent that I pick a team, you are correct. I am a fan of West Ham. Could not name a player. Have not seen a game.
I love it. I love it. So you're just like most of the people out there that swear that they've been diehards for the past 30 years and probably have just been in that situation.
Yeah, I declared on the air. I said, "Fine, let's pick a team." I pick West Ham. Let's go Hammers. But I literally could not tell. I literally have not seen a second of a game and could not. You could say, "What do you think about this player?" And I would have no idea if you've made him up or if he's actually a star.
Have you ever seen? There was a British comedy show, and I can't remember what it's called now. But basically, they say something or they repeat a bunch of like just vague sports terms. So you just need to go watch that and then learn those terms, and then you can talk to the soccer people.
There you go. Yeah. I get into that. So yeah, if any of your listeners have any suggestions for who my favorite Hammer of all time should be, by all means, throw it out there.
I love it. I love it. I was gonna get this started off on a bad note because I'm an Arsenal fan. Okay. And that is the direct rival to West Ham. So we're gonna go back and forth a little bit on that. But now I know it's safe.
How about this, Etan? Do this for me, favor. If you were on the other side, if you were, meaning you or me, you were a diehard, lifelong West Ham fan, and you're telling me Arsenal's the bitter rival, which literally maybe you're telling the truth, maybe you're not. I honestly don't even know. But let's pretend that you're telling the truth. Who should be the player that I hate, right? Because I was, I'll give you an example. So I'm a diehard Laker fan.
Okay.
And for years, I hated Bruce Bowen because I always thought he played us a little dirty. He always played Kobe tough. Bruce Bowen drove me crazy. And Bruce Bowen, of course, then became an NBA analyst for ESPN. And I would see him in the halls. And he's like the sweetest guy in person. And I would be like, dude, I'm a Lakers fan. And I'm a Kobe fan. And do you have any idea how many times I've cursed you out? And he just laughed and he says, "You're not the first guy to say that to me." And so who's my Arsenal? Who do I hate on Arsenal? Who's my Bruce Bowen of Arsenal? Who's like a punk, the kind of guy that like Draymond Green. Like if you're not a Warriors fan, if you're a fan of any other team, like you hate Draymond Green, right? Who's that guy for Arsenal?
Oh man, Thierry Henry was that guy for a long time.
Right.
Robin van Persie, more recently, was probably a guy that you might hate. But I mean, Arsenal's had their own struggles anyway, so it's kind of been up and down with us too.
Robin van Persie, that sounds like the kind of guy you could hate. Yeah, screw Van Persie.
Oh man, I love it.
Hell with Van
Persie. But I mean, I just kind of wanted to talk about fandom, though. You mentioned that you were a diehard Laker fan.
Yeah.
Fandom seems to be one thing that just brings so many people together. In fact, a lot of what you wrote in your book, Fantasy Life, kind of goes over, what fandom can do for the individual and how fandom can actually bring people from completely different stages of life, classes, so on and so forth together. So I guess my question is this, tell me about maybe a story or two that led to maybe you becoming a Laker fan and how that maybe got you interested in fantasy as a whole.
Well, being a Laker fan did not get me interested in fantasy. I became a Laker fan when I graduated college. I was 22 years old and I moved to LA. Understand, I'm 50. So, I mean, it's quite some time ago, right? But I moved to LA when I was 22, and my second year, I think when my 23-year-old, when I was 23, I decided to buy season tickets to the Lakers. It was their last year at the Forum, just to give you an idea of how long ago this was. And their head coach was Del Harris. And so it was pre-Phil Jackson, pre-Shaq, pre-Kobe. And, it was, I think, I don't think Shaq was there the first year. I think it certainly was pre-Kobe. But anyway, so, but I wanted, to follow the local team. And then, of course, they got Phil Jackson, they got Shaq, they got Kobe. They won all those titles. I was there. I was a season ticket holder for, I think, 15 years for the Lakers and, loved every minute of it. So just an amazing ride, right? It's, it's easy to root for a team when they win. So so there's what that is. But I think it's interesting when you talk about fantasy and fandom. How I got into fantasy was I was 14 years old and I was living in Texas. And when I'd grown up, I'd always been a football fan, but I never really a baseball fan. So I lived in Virginia until I was 12 years old. So that's where I'm a Washington Redskins fan, if anyone's familiar with that. And so that's where my Redskins fandom comes from living in Virginia. But I never got into the Orioles. This is obviously well before the Nationals played there. Never really got into the Orioles. And so as a young kid, so when I moved to Texas at age 12, I was 14 years old and I got invited to a fantasy baseball league. This is 1984. And this is pre-internet. This is pre anything. They literally the original book, the Rotisserie League Baseball, that book had come out in December of 1983. And so I was in probably one of the first 50 fantasy baseball leagues in America that was formed there. And the reason I did that was because I was a sports fan, but I didn't have a baseball team. I just moved there. So I wasn't really into the Rangers or the Astros and, didn't really follow the Orioles. So it was a way for me to become a fan of baseball. And that's what got me into fantasy when I was 14. Like I'd read the book and I thought the book was so funny and interesting. And they made it seem so much fun. And, it's the book is described as the greatest game for baseball fans since baseball. And I highly recommend if you ever get a copy of the book or any of it, and if you want, you can just Google. I just wrote an article for ESPN.com because this spring is the 40th anniversary of fantasy baseball, of the very first fantasy baseball league. And so anyway, I wrote an article about that. And if anyone's interested there, to your point, though, the last thing I'll say on this topic is that that fantasy, the great thing about fantasy is that it creates fans, and it creates fans for players in situations that wouldn't exist. I believe it or not, I once got into a Twitter fight with Jeremy Maclin. This is a true story. And you can Google this because a bunch of blogs wrote about it. But I went back and forth with Jeremy Maclin because Jeremy Maclin just took a shot at fantasy players, and just saying how he doesn't care. And he had just signed a huge contract with the Kansas City Chiefs.
Yeah.
And he said, by the way, I don't care about your fantasy team. I only care about helping the Chiefs. I only care about Kansas City or something like that. And I wrote him back and I said, listen, nor should you care about our fantasy teams. You should only care about helping the Chiefs win. I said, but why take a shot at fantasy players? All they are additional Jeremy Maclin fans. He's just like, man, you guys all, care about your stats and blah, blah, blah. He takes another shot at us, replies back to me. And I'm like, listen, man, part of the reasons why you just got paid $19 million or whatever the number was, is that I'm paraphrasing this whole conversation, but basically I said fantasy players drive engagement, they drive revenue, they drive TV ratings, which is one of the reasons why the Chiefs were able to pay you $19 million. And, I don't understand the downside of, there's going to be Chiefs fans, but what's the problem with you having additional people that are out there rooting for Jeremy Maclin to do well? What's the downside of that? There's going to be a lot of people that draft you in fantasy. And so, we went back and forth and he told me that I was messed up and I don't know, whatever, stupid Twitter beef. But that's the thing is that, I always talk about this and I've done some work. I have a relationship with the NFLPA, with the Players Association, because they reached out to me a number of years ago and said, can you help us monetize fantasy for the players? And so I consult for them and I do some work for them in that regard. And, because the thing about fantasy is, and you guys realize this, is that, look, there's 20-ish NFL players that need no help at all, right?
Yeah.
Patrick Mahomes, whatever, Tom Brady, the superstars, right? Saquon Barkley, those guys, they need no help at all. Odell Beckham, they're household names. I said, but the only people that know who the hell DJ Shark is are fantasy players. Seriously, what I mean? He's a good wide receiver, but he's on a crappy team in a small market. But fantasy players know exactly who DJ Shark is.
Yeah, the for instance on that, I like to talk to my girlfriend about fantasy football sometimes and ask her, do you even know who this player is? And I can name superstars. She knows who Mahomes is, Kamara is, Chubb. Right. But then I start talking, do you know who this person is? And she's like, well, I've heard the name. It's like, oh my God. How do you not know who this person is?
Yeah, but the reason she's heard the name is exactly what Matthew was saying.
Because of me.
I mean, because of fantasy and because of all the information that's out there surrounding that. So yeah, that definitely does make a lot of sense. And just driving engagement to the NFL and to all these other sports is just a way to, like I was saying before, bring more and more people together to the game and become fans of teams, of players that might not even be on the team that you support.
Yeah, 1,000% correct. I assure you that, the only people that care about Bryce Love at the moment are, diehard fantasy players, right? Or dynasty players, right? That, that have only the most diehard Steelers fans know who Deontay Johnson is, right? I mean, so it's just like, but fantasy players know exactly who Deontay Johnson is. So it's, that's one of the great things about fantasy is it creates fandom, in players and situations and teams that you normally wouldn't care about. And it does also create those awkward moments where you're sitting there like, oh, I'm a Redskins fan. Like, I need the Redskins to win, but can they win like 43-42? And I just need Dak Prescott to throw 3 touchdowns to Michael Gallup. And and this touchdown needs to it needs to be a touchdown from Dak Prescott, but not to Blake Jarwin, and so
that's both of us on this podcast. We're both Bronco fans. We love Patrick Mahomes. So sitting there like we want him to do well, but at the same time, we're hoping the Broncos win the game, and it's hard to reconcile that.
Yeah, 100%. Exactly right. Exactly right.
So my next question is, you were a writer before all of this. You went into eventually writing Hollywood scripts, so on and so forth. What kind of led you to write in the way that you do? Because it's something that I find so unique about at least the Love Hate column you put out is the amount of personal anecdotes and personal stories that go into that and how you so seamlessly relate that into your subject matter. Was there, I guess, an inspiration that kind of led you to be able to make those connections? Or, I mean, how did you kind of adapt what you were doing to what you were doing now?
So it's twofold, right? So I think it's both. I think your question is about both style and subject matter, right? So style is that it's a very deliberate. It's harder than you'd think. You'd be amazed at how hard I work at how tough it is to make me sound fairly crappy, right? But it's like the idea is that I try to write in a very conversational tone, right? As if I'm sort of talking to you. Like it's not particularly, I try not to use like big words or fancy words. And so, it's just like a normal conversation. So it's a conversational tone. And that comes from both just sort of, my personal preference. There was a humor writer, a brilliant humor writer that I used to read all the time when I was growing up by the name of Dave Barry. Barry, so no relation at all. He may still be a columnist for the Miami Herald, but he won a Pulitzer Prize. He's written a number of books, but he's a humor columnist, like has nothing to do with sports. But anyway, when I was growing up, Dave Barry was a big deal, and I used to read him quite a bit. And he has a very conversational tone. His humor is a little more sophomoric than mine, which is saying something because I have sophomoric humor too. But he likes booger jokes. But anyway, Dave Barry's a brilliant writer, and so that's a style that I always enjoyed. And there's other writers as well that were conversational that I sort of grasp onto. So that's one thing too, is that I always sort of felt like my attitude has always been that fantasy football is fun, right? Like we all want to win and we all want to crush our opponents and dominate our league and blah, 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 blah. But ultimately it's a hobby, man. It's something we do for fun. It's something to kill the time and give us a rooting interest in games we wouldn't care about. And it's, it's about camaraderie and hanging out with your buddies and talking trash. And so I've always tried to maintain that in my columns and, and basically sort of embrace that. And, and so again, that just goes back to sort of, again, that conversational style of just like the fun part of sports and fantasy is, again, like, hang out at a bar and watch the game with your buddies. And so what would that sound like in column form was sort of how I tried to approach it. And then in terms of subject matter, so you're asking about, so then that's just style. And then you're asking about the idea of really to basically write about myself and be very egocentric. And the idea for that is twofold. In terms of, you asked about inspiration, and I've written about this before, but the inspiration there, honestly, is Howard Stern. I'm a huge Howard Stern fan. I've listened to him for years and years and years. And one of the things that about Howard is that I actually was very lucky and I've gotten to meet Howard a few times over the years now, but I didn't meet him for probably 25 years. But by the time when I met him, I felt like I knew him intimately because of how candid and open he is on his radio show every day. And I always thought that inspires passion, right? That I feel like, from my point of view, like I feel like I know Howard and I understand, his strengths and his weaknesses, and it makes me root for him, right? Howard's one of my guys, kind of thing. And so I thought that was really kind of smart, and I thought that was really interesting. When I started in the industry, I felt like the majority of the writing out there was very generic, that you could take a column from, a bunch of fantasy sports websites, and if you just took off the header and you took off who it was written by, that you couldn't tell who wrote this start sit column and who wrote that start sit column, and who, that there was all just, everyone's looking at the same players and looking at the same stats, and you can say you like Deshaun Hamilton or say you hate Deshaun Hamilton, since you guys are Broncos fans, right?
Yeah.
That you think the Melvin Gordon trade is good for his value or bad for his value, but we're all looking at the same stats and the same players. And so I felt like it was just very generic, and that if you did what I just described, you wouldn't be able to tell who wrote which column. But that I thought that, with my particular style, with this very conversational tone, and if I made everything about me and very egocentric, I thought that whether you loved me or hated me, that you immediately look at this, and I still think this to this day. Like, you could take my thing off ESPN, you could pull off my name and the headline and everything like that, and put it in the same font as everything else, and you give somebody 5 articles, pick any 4 other fantasy football articles, and anyone that's read me even once would be like, oh, that's Matthew Berry. Even if they hate me, even if they can't stand my writing, they would be like, that's a Matthew Berry column. And so that was very deliberate. And I thought, Etan, just to finish up this thought, my feeling is that listen, I think I'm pretty good with stats, but listen, I'm not Nate Silver, I'm not Bill James, I'm not Mike Clay, my colleague at ESPN, who's amazing. Like, I'm not one, I'm good with stats, but I'm not those guys. And I'm pretty good at breaking down film, but listen, I'm not Matt Bowen, I'm not Dan Orlovsky, I'm not Teddy Bruschi, some of the guys at ESPN that do such a great job with that, with the X's and O's. Like, I'm not those guys. And listen, I have a bunch of sources around the NFL, but I'm not Adam Schefter. I'm not Mort. So it's like, I do a bunch of things decently, but like, I'm not the best at any of them. But what I thought the one thing I could do better than anyone else in the world was write about me. And so it was the one thing that I knew, like, like the rest of the stuff, there's going to be people out there that are better than me at this or that. But this is one thing that no one can do better than I can. At least this is one thing that I can excel at, is writing about me. And so that was all those decisions sort of went into sort of trying to create my own style, and, inspired by Howard Stern and his success. And, if you Google Matthew Berry, love, hate, Howard Stern, you'll read an article about that talks about my Howard's influence on me in greater detail.
That's awesome. I will say, and I'm sure this is true for many writers out there, that I respect your writing, because I'm not the most creative of writers, and I'm one of those generic start sit column guys. I try to be a little bit more open and honest about my process and what I got wrong and right. But other than that, like you said, you cut my name off of the header and stuff, and you don't know who writes it. And so I always aspire, I aspire to be you, because you draw attention to your article with your stories. And I know that's one of the things that I want to build on is my creative writing capabilities. So I maybe just kissing your butt a little bit, but I respect you a lot, and you're somebody I look up to in the fantasy world.
Well, Sam, that's kind of you to say, and I really appreciate it. But my counsel to you back would be twofold, and I would say this to anyone that feels similarly to you, which is that I appreciate that, but what I would say to you is, like, don't try to be me, man. Like, do your own thing. Like, find your niche. There's millions of ways to sort of make your mark. You know what I mean? Like, again, Mike Clay. I think Mike, I'm a big Mike Clay fan. He's terrific, but Mike will be the first person to tell you that he's not the most creative's not wrong, because he is creative, but he's just like, he has a very different style than I do. And he's very nuts and bolts, and but like he has found ways through his data, through his research, whether it's the OTD, whether it's the cornerback wide receiver matchup, he's created some stats, he's created opportunities, he's created some franchises for himself, in terms of what he's done at ESPN, like in terms of, column that he just wrote that came out, like, he does all of our projections. And so a great article, 50 things I learned while doing ESPN's projections. And just, as he started doing all the research, and so it's about finding your niche and what you do better than anyone else, and then just getting better. And it's reps, man. Like, as we talked about, I've been playing fantasy sports since I was 14 years old. I've been writing about it professionally. I started in Roto World in '99. So, this is my 21st year of writing fantasy sports. So hopefully I'm not terrible at it by now. Right. Yeah. So, so it's just, it's reps, and it's finding your own voice and finding inspiration from somebody else, and like, so, like I said, Howard's somebody that inspired me a lot. And, there are other people as well. I've taken stuff from Dave Barry, and, listen, there were a lot of analysts when I was coming up as well that I respect a tremendous amount. Ron Chandler is one that, like, I have a tremendous amount of respect for. But anyway, I appreciate that. But my counsel to you would be to not sweat trying to be like me or whoever out there, people you admire, but to try to find what makes you tick, what you think is, unique about your analysis, and figuring out, different ways to highlight that.
Well, I appreciate that advice.
I love the very pointed, very calculated way you went about explaining why it is you do what you do. I think that's a question that's very difficult for a lot of people to answer. And I'm really, really happy that you're able to kind of get to just the exact thought that you were trying to convey there. I do really appreciate that. As a final kind of get to know you type question, I guess my question would be this. Obviously, being a grinder, being a person that puts in a lot of work, networking, all of these things are things that are a given in getting anywhere in any industry, but especially in media. I wanted to ask you, are there any soft skills that you learned that you didn't pick up professionally, not in writing, not in doing anything that you do now, that you thought made you different when trying to break into the industry? Is there anything that maybe you picked up as a kid, or anything that maybe one of your hobbies allowed you to be more exposed to, that you kind of took and molded into something that could differentiate your work down the line?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I would encourage anyone that's interested in the answer to this, because I'll give a short answer here, short-ish. I tend to talk long, I write long, I talk long, but I wrote an article about career advice. And so I think if you literally just Google Matthew Berry love, hate career advice, it'll come up. I've written a couple of versions of that article over the years. And so, so there's a couple of things, right? And so first off, what I would say is communication. And I know that sounds insane, but one of the most important thing my father ever taught me, and my father's a college professor and brilliant one at that, and teaches to this day at Texas A&M University, Giga Mags, is that my father was like, you need to learn how to communicate. That's the most important thing, is you must learn how to communicate. Because his take was, look, you could cure cancer, But if you can't explain it to anyone, it does no one any good at all. He goes, whatever it is you do, you need to be able to communicate it. And so so just for an example, when I was before I ever became a writer, a columnist, when I was writing movies and TV, and by the way, and I wrote a humor column for my student newspaper at Syracuse University, but I always felt like, that it was important to be able to communicate. So when I was out there in Hollywood, I took 3 years of classes at the Groundlings, the world famous Groundlings. It's an improv troupe. Will Ferrell's come out of there. And I mean, just many, 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 I believe Tina Fey was a Groundling. She may have come out of Chicago in Second City.
Yeah, I think she was Second City.
She might have been Second City, but there's a long list of like John Lovitz and Pee Wee Herman, and you can look it up, like Chris Kattan, and like half the famous people, Chris Parnell, half these famous people that are on. I think Sherry O'Terry as well was a Groundling, and anyway, you can look it up. But there's Dana Carvey was probably one. So there's it's a world famous improv troupe in Los Angeles, and I took 3 years of classes, not because I thought I could act, but just because I wanted to be comfortable in front of people that I didn't know, and ready, being able to react to any situation in a comfortable manner. And so they, in these classes, they make you get up and like, okay, now you're a chicken, and you have to like act like a chicken in front of 25 people that you've just met, right? And there's all these wacky scenarios, and so I did that because my thought at the time was, again, wanting to learn how to communicate and also wanting to be able to, pitch. All right. So that's one skill that I've learned, is just being able to communicate. Right. And I think it's one of the reasons why, people, I think, enjoy the opens to my columns. Right. Is that I'm able to communicate, whether it's writing, I've written about this, but I think one of the skills that ESPN values about me is that I can do an hour-long podcast. I can do a 3-hour TV show. I can do a 8-minute segment on SportsCenter. I can do a 45-second segment on NFL Live. I can do a 10-minute radio hit. Whatever. I can do a 45-minute podcast. Et cetera. Whatever. Somebody else's podcast. Right, and write a 1,500 word or 5,000, in my case, a 5,000 word column. I can be reasonably entertaining in an Instagram post or a 280 character tweet. And so, listen, I'm better at some of those things than others, but I'm reasonably competent at all of them. And they're all different skill sets. Doing a 90-second hit on NFL Live is very different than doing an 8-minute radio hit, which is different than, doing a 3-hour TV show, which is different than doing an hour-long live broadcast, via Twitter and our podcast. And so they're all different skill sets, but they all involve one thing at the core, which is communication.
I love it.
Yeah. And here, I'll give you one other quick little soft skill, was just trying to be, make myself known, try to think of ways that I could get myself known. When I was trying to break into show business, I was trying to get a job as a production assistant, which is basically a gopher. Like, it's the lowest level job. Right. But they're hard jobs to get because everyone wants to be into show business. Right. And so I sent out, the first thing I did is I made my job getting a job. Like I would get up in the morning. I would send out a bunch of resumes, and every resume was different. I tailored it specifically to that job, and then in the afternoon I would follow up. And at the time I was working at a toy store. I was actually working at FAO Schwartz in Beverly Hills, like just to pay the rent.
I think I read this story.
Yeah, I was rent retail. And so I, every time I got an interview at FAO Schwartz, we sold these bubble guns. Like, they were like little plastic guns that shot bubbles, that you blow, right? Like sort of soap bubbles. Like, it's whatever. It's a gun that shot bubbles, a bubble gun. And so at the end of the interview, I would give them a bubble gun. They were like $6 or something like that. I would give them a bubble gun as a gift. And they'd be like, "What's this?" And I say, and I explained, this is what I'm doing. I'm working at FAO Schwartz, but I'm trying to get in, to show business. I said, "Listen, I'm sure you're meeting with 20, 30, 50 people, and I'm trying to stand out. I want you to remember me. And I bet you're going to remember the guy that brought you a bubble gun to the dumb interview. dumb bubble gun to the interview. And they would smile and laugh and like, yeah, you're probably right. And they would take the gun. And I got my first job in show business on the 5th gun interview. And she remembered it. Like when I would call back, I'm like, hey, it's Matthew Berry calling to follow up on the job. Tell her it's the guy that brought her the bubble gun. They all remembered. So just trying to find out ways to stand out.
So you're saying me making a video in a singlet, a wrestling promo video in a singlet, was a good move for my career in fantasy sports?
I don't think it was a bad one.
It might have been bad for everybody else involved, but not me.
But yeah, I mean, it doesn't have to be shock for shock value, but just, I'm a big believer in playing the cards you're dealt, whatever those cards are. And so for me, I think I'm reasonably funny, reasonably entertaining, and I had show business connections. And so trying to use those and lean on those. And so it's all about playing the hand you're dealt and playing to your strengths, knowing what you do well and knowing what you don't.
Perfect. Now I wanted to ask you, we do have a few other questions here, but it's been about 30 minutes. Do you have time for them? If not, okay, no, perfect. We'll go into them. So let's get into actual football now with our 5-point inspection. We're going to talk about the team that we just talked about fandom. You mentioned you were a fan of the Washington Redskins. How real is Terry McLaurin? Let's talk about Ron Rivera. And is there any hope fantasy-wise for Darius Geis with all the other backs that the Redskins have brought in?
All right, so all good questions. I'm going to give you a piece of advice, if I may. So this is something. So at ESPN, we get one of the things we got to do a interview class, how to interview somebody, from a guy named John Sawatsky, who is a brilliant interviewer. But John Sawatsky had all these rules for interviewing, and one of them is one question, only one question. So you asked me 3 questions there. You asked me about Terry McLaurin, you asked me about Ron Rivera, you asked me about Darius Geis. So I think that's one little tidbit that I will pass along. It's not mine. It's from the brilliant John Sawatsky. But there you go. So let's start with Terry McLaurin. I think he's very real. I mean, so here's a guy that was a top 30 wide receiver last year in terms of fantasy points per game on an offense that was broken with a bunch of different quarterbacks, where there was no one else to take any any pressure off, right? So this is a guy that was top 12 among wide receivers in yards per target. He was top 12 among wide receivers in catch percentage above expectation, right? Here's a guy that got he was tied for 7th among wide receivers in end zone targets. You don't think of him as a big guy, but here's a guy that they were looking for when they got in close. 16th among top 15 among wide receivers in fantasy points on deep passes. I mean, so I think he's completely legitimate. And I will also tell you, just talking around the Redskins organization, it's the easy thing, but they're going to install Carolina's offense. And I think the way to think of Terry McLaurin this year is think about DJ Moore last year. Like that, that's how they're going to use him. They're going to move him all over the place. They're going to take deep shots to him. I think they'll actually use him. He'll be more versatile than DJ Moore was last year a little bit because they don't have much else. The Redskins will definitely take somebody in the draft, I think, and it's a deep draft. We'll see if they get anything out of Steven Sims, Kelvin Harmon, whatever. But I mean, look, the Redskins are going to have to throw, and whether it's Haskins or Kyle Allen, he's going to be the number 1 target. So he's a guy that I think is going to be easily top 15 in the NFL in targets this year, and to have the kind of year he did on that offense with those quarterbacks as a rookie, unbelievable. Big fan of Terry McScorin. By the way, that's my other big thing is, can we get like stop with the F1 or the Scary Terry or anything. They're all they're freaking awful nicknames.
Yeah.
Terry McScorin. Terry McScorin.
There, you hear it here first.
Happen.
It's Terry McScorin.
I love it. That has to be the show title right there, Terry McScorin.
So I agree with on your analysis of Terry McLaurin. Obviously, had putting up numbers like he did with, like you said, the myriad of quarterbacks, the myriad of subpar, at best mediocre quarterbacks. That is, and only on 93 targets. The concern here is, do you think that Dwayne Haskins takes a step forward? And if not, is Kyle Allen enough? And we did see Kyle Allen most of the season last season provide enough targets for DJ Moore to be extremely relevant.
Yeah, right. And by the way, just to give you, just when you think about this, now I don't think the Redskins defense is going to be nearly as bad as Carolina's was last year.
Sure.
But Panthers were top 3 in NFL pass attempts. I think they passed the second most in the NFL. That's off the top of my head, but it was second or third most. I mean, people don't realize this. Like, so DJ Moore, Curtis Samuel, the combo of Greg Olsen and Ian Thomas, and Christian McCaffrey all had over 100 targets last year. And the Redskins don't have a guy like McCaffrey. So do they pass as much as Carolina last year? No, but are they going to be a pass-first offense? I think they're going to be under Scott Turner. You know, Scott obviously learned from his father, Norv, and Norv is always pass-first, and they've been pass-heavy in Carolina. Now, again, some of that is situationally dictated because of how bad their defense was last year. But still, they're going to be throwing. So, you know, I think, you know, I definitely think, assuming health, I think he definitely gets, you know, well over 100 targets this year. Now, in terms of the quarterback play, yeah, I will tell you that it's interesting. In a normal year, I would say 100% Haskins gets there. The problem is that we just don't know when they're going to get to training camp. And, you know, with everything that's going on with COVID-19, it's just hard to know at what point does Dwayne Haskins just get on the field and start working with guys, right? And start working with Scott Turner and, you know, going through the reps and understanding the offense. And it's one of the reasons Rivera has talked about this. One of the reasons they got Kyle Allen, that if it's a very short preseason and there's no OTAs or anything like that, because of, you know, everything's going on with coronavirus, that, you know, Kyle Allen knows the offense and can step in and be listen, he ain't the future. He ain't a franchise guy, but, you know, can he be competent? He can be competent, you know? And so I think there's that also, because I don't think Rivera thinks they're going to compete this year. Like right. His job is to try to, you know, and he knows it and it's fine. They've got a lot of holes. So it's like, I'm going to change the culture. And if we can, you know, go 6-10, I'm making stuff up now, you know what I mean? But I'm reading between the lines. But, you know, if I'm Ron Rivera and I'm like, listen, if we can go 6-10, 7-9 and play and just be a really tough out, right? 6-10, but we're a bitch to play every week. Like, that's great. Yeah. Right? I mean, like, seriously, like, you know what I mean? Like, it's a franchise that needs a lot of, like, and that you talk about this all the time, that changed the culture. And that doesn't happen overnight. At least it's not going to happen overnight in Washington. And so I will tell you, though, from talking to, listen, I interviewed at the Combine. I interviewed Scott Turner. I interviewed Kyle Smith. I interviewed Ron Rivera. I talked to a lot of sources in and around the team. And I will tell you, to a man, in a bunch of separate conversations, some on the record, some off, but they all are like, we think Haskins is the real deal. We think he's the real deal. We think, you know, like, you know, are there flaws in his game? Sure. But they think, look, you know, big arm, cannon for an arm, guy that, like, isn't afraid to stand in the pocket and take a hit, understands defenses and reads them well, reads the field well. Guy threw 50 touchdowns for Ohio State. People forget this. He threw 50 touchdowns for Ohio State. Like, that's not nothing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, that's 50 touchdowns for Ohio State is not nothing. Even if, you know, even though they had, you know, he had Paris Campbell and he had McLaurin and he had a great offensive line, you know, they're playing real teams. And so I do ultimately think Dwayne Haskins will be good enough to get Terry McLaurin the ball. Again, top 30 last year with, you know, right, with Haskins, Colt McCoy, Case Keenum, you know, like.
Why? And he only had 93 targets. I think that's at the end of the day, that's the main argument here is there's nobody there that's going to garner that. I mean, a large target share like Terry McLaurin, like there was in Carolina. So,
and then in addition to that, I mean, you talked about, Matthew, with the pass attempts out in Carolina and what they're going to establish in Washington this season. The volume is going to be there. Last year, the Redskins had the 28th most pass attempts in the league, at least per game, 33.1 per game. And they were actually one of the slowest teams in the league as well. Whereas when you look at Carolina, we just mentioned, had one of the most pass attempts overall in the league, and they had looks like the 5th highest situation neutral pace in the entire league. So if we see this Washington offense running faster, all of these players are just going to have more opportunities to go ahead and score some fantasy points for all of us.
Yeah, I mean, listen. Sam brings up a great point in terms of why didn't he get more targets on a team that was going nowhere. I mean, look, he was doubled and triple teamed a lot towards the end of the season, right? And they had some, situations where they were going up against teams that that would put their shutdown corner, right? But I will tell you that, I saw an interview this offseason with Darius Slay, who just said like one of the toughest guys I've ever had to guard was Terry McLaurin this year. Like, he put some moves on me that, and so, that's Darius Slay, right? And so, and he'll now get to see Darius Slay this year twice. But the fact, so I think that's partially it, but I also think, guys, to Eton's point, is I think partially it's also like their offense was just a mess last year, right? I mean, it was a team in transition, and they were sort of running Gruden's offense, but then Callahan came in, and Callahan was like, "We're going to run the ball. I'm a football guy." And, and so, listen, and I think I'm disappointed that Callahan moved on, because I think he did a great job with what he had to work with the offensive line. He's one of the best offensive line coaches in the NFL. But and also I think he just realized what he had in the passing game, and he thought that was the best chance he had to compete, was just to try to run the ball. But certainly, again, it's going to be a Norv Turner-ish offense in Washington, and that's obviously not run heavy. It's going to be, it's some runs, but also, trying to utilize the running back, get the running back in space, and try to space guys out and do some stuff underneath, and some of that, crossing routes, and it's a version of the West Coast offense.
All right, so I'm going to take your advice and ask you one question this time.
Okay.
So Darius Geis, obviously they brought in just a myriad of backs to that team right now. I think Darius Geis is one of 5-6 people on the roster. I'm sure most of these guys aren't going to make it past training camp, but there's some obvious concern from the team as to whether or not he can be the long-term answer, because the question of whether or not he can stay healthy is a real one. So should Dynasty owners specifically be worried about Darius Geis moving forward? Do you think they should be all in?
I think they should be nervous. And listen, I love Darius Geis. Love him as a player. I've met him a few times. Love him as a guy. Like, he's got infectious energy. Like, really love the guy. 2 years ago, he was my fantasy ride or die. But I think, Eton, I think you read it right. They re-signed Adrian Peterson, fine. That's also partially, it's partially depth. It's also partially changing the culture, because whatever you may think of Adrian Peterson, I can tell you that he's beloved, capital B, beloved in that locker room. So people really look up to him, and he's very influential in that locker room. So that's part of it. But then, right, they have Bryce Love, who, coming off the ACL, but coming out of Stanford, was thought of to be a much higher running back. Dynasty leaguers are well aware of Bryce Love. They just signed Peyton Barber to a 2-year deal. They have somebody else too. Oh, they have JD McKissick from Seattle, and they have somebody else that I'm forgetting off the top of my head. Is it Josh Ferguson? Is Josh Ferguson there? Anyway, but they have it's a big running back room, and some of that's camp depth. But the Peyton Barber signing was certainly a little eyebrow raising, and so I'm concerned. I'm concerned that Washington is concerned, and that they don't think, because the appeal of Geis is that he could be a 3-down back, right? He's a really good pass catcher. You haven't seen it yet in the NFL or in LSU, but I mean, just, he was doing that in practice. And so, it's just a concern. Look, we know the explosiveness, right? Here's a guy that's averaged almost 6 yards per carry in his short NFL career, right? He's literally only gotten 11 touches, 11 or more touches. And he's only played 4 full games in the NFL, and he's got 3 touches, gaining 30+ yards already. Look, he was a little bit banged up in college. He's now, he's been injured to miss most of the first 2 years of his NFL career. I think I'm concerned.
It's 3 major knee injuries for me. I mean, you hear from Pro Football Doc, David Chow, from other guys, Ethan Turner, Matt Betts, those guys, Stephania Bell as well. That I mean, it's an ACL, and you've seen another major knee injury on the other knee as well, which may have to do with compensation for the ACL. Who knows? But it's 3 major injuries in 2 years, right? So,
guys,
that's scary.
Breaking news. You see this?
Yes, I did. And I'll let you do it since you're the master.
Just got an alert that Brandon Cooks is now a member of the Texans. Not surprising that it seemed like it was kind of a lost season for him on the Rams. Boy, it makes sense. They've lost DeAndre Hopkins. You need a deep wide receiver here, and here comes Brandon Cooks, who is super talented, but it's also interesting, right? Like Saints, Patriots, Rams. He's a young guy and he's now on his 4th NFL team, right? And it's not like Brandon Cooks has gone to Washington, right? Or other dysfunctional NFL franchises. I mean, think about that. The Saints, the Patriots, the Rams under McVay. The only thing I saw, because I'm using my phone to dial into this thing, was just I got an alert that just said Texans acquire Brandon Cooks. So I don't know who they got him for, what the parameters of the trade are. I just saw that Brandon Cooks is going to the Texans.
Yeah, I actually just wrote a tweet about Brandon Cooks because he's going like in the 40s in terms of wide receivers right now in startups. And that seems like huge value to me, considering he had 4 straight seasons of 1,000-yard receiving.
Sure.
And now, and not to mention, he did it with 3 different quarterbacks. Now he can try and do it with a 4th. And a gigantic hole was put into that offense with the DeAndre Hopkins trade. So there's a lot of targets to be had there. Now the concern is, are Brandon Cooks and Will Fuller the same type of receiver? And how much do they eat into each other's targets?
Yeah, you know what? I mean, I actually think Brandon Cooks can be more than that. Like, I mean, I think he can do the underneath stuff. I think he can do, I think he's got a pretty good route tree. He's obviously super fast, and I think he sort of got pigeonholed as that, certainly in LA and in New Orleans. I feel like they used him a little bit differently than that in New England. But certainly, your reaction, I think I'd rather, I've spent literally 30 seconds thinking about this, but I think when I do my new rankings, I'll have Brandon Cooks as the highest ranked Texans wide receiver. I think I'll take him over Will Fuller just because, again, to your point, we've seen Brandon Cooks be fantasy relevant. Like, we've seen him be a top 15 fantasy wide receiver.
Yep.
I believe 1,000 yards, I believe, first three years in
it was 4 straight after his first season. He didn't get it his rookie season.
4,000-yard seasons after that.
Yeah.
But his fantasy finishes prior to last year were all pretty good. We're all, I think, top 20-ish.
Yep. I believe that's right. Yep.
So you think about Will Fuller, who, again, and Will Fuller, insanely talented, right? But the other thing about Will Fuller is that it's those soft tissue injuries. And, Will Fuller, not only can you, are there injury concerns about missing games, but Will Fuller, I feel like somebody should look this up. Will Fuller, let's see, here's the, okay. So it's just a pick 57 from the Texans goes for Brandon Cooks in a 4th.
That's not bad at all.
No, not bad at all. Bill O'Brien making a good trade.
Counterintuitive to what we saw earlier this season.
I guess he just had to make you up for himself.
Yeah, counterintuitive. And so, but yeah, I mean, Will Fuller he probably leads the NFL in games left early, right? I mean, I would love to know the stat on how many games he started but left early, which is the worst in fantasy when you're like, because at least if they're ruled out before the game, you can replace them. But there's nothing worse than the guy that leaves the game early and you're just like, and you're just sitting there. So, fascinating move. And certainly that's going to move Deshaun Watson back up in my ranks. And, that moves Brandon Cooks up in my ranks, obviously, because he's buried in LA. Moves Will Fuller down. Don't think it changes much for me with the Rams. I don't think I'm suddenly increasing, because when I had ranked Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods, my little Cooper Kupp, I had taken into account the idea that I think you'll see more Tyler Higbee. I think this means it's another way of that. I think they want to go more 2 tight end sets, which they had some success with last year. And so, you'll see Higbee and Everett, with Higbee, the better pass catcher, if you will, or the more relevant one for fantasy. Although Everett had some nice games there too.
Sean McVay actually came out and said that he intends to use Gerald Everett more now. Whether or not that happens, we'll see.
Yeah, well, we'll see. Exactly. Sean McVay also said he was going to use Todd Gurley all year long until, and I love.
And he was perfectly fine too.
I think McVay's a genius, but so we'll see. But it's interesting. It's certainly interesting. Dynasty stock of Josh Reynolds up a little bit now.
Is there any concern that this can all fall apart for the Texans, though? Because we just talked about Will Fuller's injuries, recurring injuries. Brandon Cooks, I think one of the main reasons that he's even traded right now is because of the concussions and what he's gone through over the past couple of years. So, they have 2 good receivers if they're on the field, but, what is the likelihood of both of these guys making it through a full season on the field, and what does that mean going forward for Deshaun Watson and for the rest of that Texans offense?
Yeah, listen, they've got a lot of, talented but flawed guys, right? It's a little bit of the clearance bargain bin at the store, right? You're like, hey, this is a nice sweater, but it's got a little, there's a little rip at the bottom kind of thing, right? Because it's like Kenny Stills has dealt with injuries. He's been inconsistent. Randall Cobb also injury prone, and certainly David Johnson. Last year for a little bit, he missed the whole season with a wrist, a couple years ago as well. So it's a bunch of talented players that when they've been healthy have been very productive, but all of them have missed significant time in their careers for injury. Maybe Kenny Stills the least, but Stills has also been a bit inconsistent just in terms of his play. So, but listen, ultimately, I think there's enough pieces there now that they'll piece something together. It's still going to be a good offense. You can criticize Bill O'Brien as a general manager. That's certainly fair. But in order to so I think that's fair, but I think the guy's a good play caller. I think the guy's a good offensive play caller. The Texans offense has been pretty good last couple of years. You can talk about his clock management and some of his timeouts and that kind of stuff, but just from an offensive play calling standpoint, I think Bill O'Brien's probably pretty good. And so my expectation is Deshaun Watson will be, he'll be a top 5 fantasy quarterback this year.
So there's so much information out there available to everyone, available to the fantasy consumer, probably even more so available to you with connections to the league and whatnot. What is your main BS detection meter? How do you separate what matters versus what is probably noise that you shouldn't be paying attention to?
It's a challenge. It's a constant challenge. And some of it you buy, some of it you don't. And and I've certainly gotten some stuff wrong, right? So it's a little bit of, I'm a big believer in just basic logic. And I know that sounds really simple, but it's true. I think, I write about this every year in sort of my draft day manifesto, that I think we as fantasy players and analysts, especially as we're trying to look at everything and trying to find that edge, we sometimes overthink things. And I believe there's a way to basically what's most likely to happen and why. And so, again, they were talking up at the combine. They were, Les Snead was like, Brandon Cooks, no, we still blah, 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 blah. But you're less like, okay, you're looking at the team, looking at the contract situation, looking how he was used last year, looking at the emergence of Tyler Higbee. Same with Todd Gurley. You were sort of like, that was easy to say, wouldn't be surprised if he moves on. Right. So. But it's always a challenge, right? It's always a challenge. So it's a little bit of, for me, it's, talking to sources, or in cases where I don't have sources, I'll text Schefter or Mort or Field Yates or Jeff Darlington or Dan Graziano or, Josina Anderson or any one of our reporters that I have a good relationship with. And, I know who, having worked with all of them for a long time, I know who knows who, right? I know, this guy has a really good relationship with the Patriots. This guy has a really good relationship with McVay. This person, this reporter knows, Kyle Shanahan, whatever it is. And so, sometimes I'll talk to our insiders and be like, hey, next time you talk to Kyle, could you ask him this about Debo or something like that, right? And so it's a little bit of trying to mix and match and use some common sense and some inside sources and just and the eye test in terms of what you think is real and not. But it's definitely a huge challenge of fantasy football analysis and playing is sort of figuring out. It used to be trying to get the information. Now it's trying to figure out what information to believe.
Going from level to level to where you've gone, making companies, selling companies to ESPN, so on and so forth, negotiation has to be one of the most important skills in all of that. So to get to where you are, you have to be a good negotiator. And in dynasty leagues, you have to be a good negotiator to be able to get decent trades. So I wanted to ask you if you have any tips for negotiating for people out there that either are looking to move up in the workplace or even just looking to get a trade done. What is your kind of basis for how you negotiate?
Well, so I try to be very honest when I negotiate, and I try to be very honest. I try to look at it from their point of view, and and I also try to let them help them see why I think the way I do. So taking that step by step. So in terms of being honest, whatever, Will Fuller. If I was trying to trade you Will Fuller, listen, assuming you're not an idiot, and I don't think either of you are idiots, right? You guys know, we'll probably be like, hey, what do you think about Will Fuller? Look, obviously the guy can't stay healthy, but he's a beast when he's on the field. Normally I would want X, but I'm willing to take Y because I know he's a question mark here. You know what I mean? So as opposed to trying to look Will Fuller, look at all these fantasy points, and on a points per game basis, he was wide receiver 12, and trying to spin it, and you're like, come on, dude. You know what I mean? So just be honest. Yeah, guy's an injury risk. He's a huge injury risk, but when he's healthy, he's a monster. And I would probably, right. So I think it's just sort of trying to be honest. And hey, my thought is you might be interested in him because you've got a couple of safe guys and you might want to take a swing at the fence. I'm looking to get rid of him because I'm trying to trade wide receiver depth. And he's the guy that has the most upside on my team, but I really need a running back. Whatever, right? So there's that. I'll tell you that I'm in a dynasty league right now, and I'm negotiating with my friend Bob Harris. And so Bob and I are going back and forth, and he has a surplus of quarterbacks, and I have a surplus of running backs. And one of the things he knows that I'm a Redskins homer, so he has Haskins. So I asked him about Haskins, and he said, "Well, what about Chris Carson for Haskins?" And I was like, "Dude," and I said. No, I said, because my belief is that if we were doing a startup dynasty draft right now, Dwayne Haskins is one of, if not the last quarterback taken.
Mm-hmm.
I said, and Chris Carson's going to go among the first 20 running backs. I said, so it's just sort of, but that was my logic of turning him down. Does that, you know what I mean? And so that was one way that in terms of dynasty, I'm like, if we were doing a dynasty startup draft today, where do these two players go?
Yeah.
So that was that's a pretty easy sort of construct to understand. And then you sort of start thinking about it. And the other thing that I do is I listen, right? And so if I was doing a fantasy trade with you, I might say all right, hey, Etan, so what do you need? Hey man, I need a running back. You got a surplus of running backs, but I'm just curious, what do you think your team needs? And so as opposed to just telling you what I think your team needs, which is sort of insulting, right? I mean, your team better than I do. And what you think, I may think you're stacked at tight end, but you may think I don't like any of these guys. I'm like, oh, okay, maybe there's an opportunity there because I love your tight ends, right? So I always try to get the other person to, tell me, hey, tell me what you need, what you're looking for, so that I can then craft an offer that appeals to them. And the last thing I always try to do it over the phone. Right. Because when you're talking on the phone, too many times people just send an email through the league, whatever the league commissioner service is. And then you get this, and you're like, what? But if you can talk to somebody and go hey, here's my thought. Again, you have 3 wide receivers that are all pretty safe, that have, high floors, but none of them have the upside of Will Fuller. He's obviously got a bunch of injury concerns. So what do you think about, I wouldn't do this deal, but what do you think about Will Fuller for Darius Geis, who's another guy that has injury concerns, but upside, right? Does that make any sense?
Oh yeah.
Like, so those are the kind of things I do. Is I always try to make it just a conversation and make it kind of an easy win, and not try to rip anybody off. Try to make it, why would this person do this trade? And like, we all value players differently, but generally, assuming you're playing in a league where people know what they're doing, and that you're playing with friends, so you're going to want to trade with them again. Try to make a reasonable offer, because again, if you're making a terrible offer, then you're like, then it becomes sort of, the boy who cried wolf, and you're just like, I don't want to talk to trade with that guy. All he does is offer me crap. So
yeah, I've gotten into that situation in a home league where I probably need to listen to your advice, because I aim high and then I negotiate down, and that has turned into, oh, this guy's just trying to screw me over. So I need to listen to you, I think, a little bit more here.
Well, but aiming high is fine, but I think you just need to be honest about it. And I think you can be like, hey, I'd love to get Mahomes. Is there any way that's possible? Is there anyone on my team? And the person says, well, yeah, I'd love McCaffrey. And then what I would do is, here's another big rule that I think people make a mistake with. That if you have Mahomes, right? If somebody comes to you and says, hey, well, I'd really love to trade for Mahomes. The instinct, everyone's just like, well, no thanks. Like if you had Mahomes in a dynasty league, and you're like, nope, no, not doing that. That's the big mistake. And I always say, so again, Google Matthew Berry trade advice, love, hate trade advice. I wrote a whole step-by-step guide this year to how I do trades. But like, the first answer should be like, okay, hey, I love Mahomes. He's going to be expensive, but everyone's available in the right deal, right? Because it is. Everyone is available in the right deal. If somebody called you up and says, hey, I'd really love Mahomes, and you're like, okay, what are you offering? And this guy says, I'll give you Lamar Jackson and Chris McCaffrey. You're trading Mahomes. You know what I mean? And so, like, it's the old joke. Hey, will you sleep? Guy says to the girl, will you sleep with me for $1? She's like, what? No, I'm not that kind of girl. He says, will you sleep with me for $10 million? And she's like, yes, yeah, for $10 million.
That's a
and
stupid
then the guy
question.
says, all right, how about for $2? She goes, no, I told you I'm not that kind of girl. And he says, you already told me you were that kind of girl. Now we're just negotiating. You know what I mean? Like it's an old joke. And,
yeah.
But that's the point of it. It's like, right. And so, so I think it's okay. Like, so if I were aiming high and going for like McCaffrey, say, listen, I know it would cost me an insane amount, and maybe you're not even open to it, but what could I possibly offer, for McCaffrey? You know what I mean? And see if there's a deal to be made. Right. And so again, the other piece of that is like, if somebody calls you about Mahomes or calls you about McCaffrey, and you're like, yeah, it costs a lot, but what's available? And then you start talking, and they start opening up the idea to, oh, well, I could trade Mahomes and get McCaffrey, and they start thinking about it. Then you can say like, that's not enough for McCaffrey, but what if I give you Derrick Henry for Mahomes? You know what I mean? And now they've gotten as you've been talking, they've gotten used to and comfortable with the idea of trading Mahomes, and you've managed to pull back McCaffrey. Am I making any sense? Like that's the idea would be is that like they need to be comfortable with the idea of letting go of this player, because fantasy players so often are like, I want to hold on to this guy forever, right? And so anyway.
Yeah. So I do have one more question to do with like trading and negotiating. So I know you're in a lot of leagues with guys in the industry, a lot of the big names in the industry. Are there any like home leagues, small leagues that you do with like family, friends, etc.? And how hard is it to negotiate with them because they know you are basically a huge name in fantasy sports? Like, do they always say like, oh, you know something that I don't, so I don't 100%. Really trust you?
all the time, and it drives me crazy, and it's awful. And so it's because that's exactly right. It's actually much easier for me to trade in industry leagues, where everyone else is, also somebody who does fantasy football analysis professionally, versus like, I'm in a league with my buddies from college. So it's been going on, since 1990. That league has been, and like I'm in a league with my wife and my kids and our friends and their kids. So I'm in a friends and family league, and I've I'm in various leagues with other friends. I do a couple of ESPN leagues and and various other leagues of just random friends. So I'm in, I think I did 16 leagues last year. So yeah, and it's always much harder in the the quote unquote regular leagues than it is in sort of the industry leagues as it is. The other thing is that anytime I go into those leagues, like the friends and family leagues, every single one of them has my rankings, even if they don't believe in them or are following them. But they've all read they've all read Love Hate. They've all read my rankings, so they know who I'm high on. They know I love, like whatever. And like I'll do like Stupid Stefania. I can't tell you how many leagues I was in where she snaked Darren Waller for me. She heard me talk about Darren Waller all preseason, and then she took Darren Waller like 10 rounds ahead of his ADP. I'm like, what are you doing to me? She goes, well, I know you want him. And I'm like,
I love that. That's great. I do that to my friends too. I know. Yeah. For instance, Boston Scott, I have a friend who loves Boston Scott this year, and I will always take him 2 rounds ahead of where he's been going because I know he's going to try and get him.
Yeah, no, 100%. Yeah, so it's it's always a challenge, but that's what makes fantasy fun.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I love how we've had this whole conversation eventually came back around to communication, which is probably the first thing that we talked about. But yeah, that was definitely very insightful and a fun topic that we went over. That is pretty much all we've got today. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening to the Dynasty Diagnostic podcast. Thank you so much, Matthew, for sitting down with us. And man, I can't wait to consume more of your work this year at ESPN.
I appreciate it, guys. Thanks so much, and good luck to you guys.
Hey, appreciate it, man. Thanks again for talking with us. We'll talk to you hopefully soon.
You bet. Take care.
Right. Yeah, you too.
Bye.
Wow, that was awesome.
Yeah.
Do you want to do a
roster
or not?
I wanted to because
it's like an hour 11.
Yeah, I mean it's up to you at this point. We have another one anyway, but
yeah,
I feel like
let's just let that one lie here. I think that was a great show anyway. It was a lot longer than I expected.
Yeah. He said he had 30 minutes to give us an hour.
So yeah, we'll release this. I can probably edit it because I think there was like one edit. So I'll edit it. I'll get that out tomorrow, and then we can release Reeves. I don't know, like Monday.
Okay, perfect.
All right,
sounds good. So we'll reconnect for Reeves, I guess, in a little bit.
Yep.
All right, man.
All right, I'll talk to you a little bit.
Bye.
Bye.